So in this lecture, we're going to be going over Visual Studio and the IDE, or Integrated Development Environment. So when you first bring up Visual Studio, you should see a screen something like this. So let's just go ahead and get started on how we're going to create a new project. So along the top here, we can select the File, New Project. And so that'll get us started with, in Visual Studio, how we can choose the project types for this class. Now you notice mine kind of defaulted up here because I've done it before. So here you can just sort of filter the project types by the language. So in our class we're going to be using C#. Also in our class we're just using Windows applications, so just choose Windows. Here let's go ahead and open this up to all project types. So you'll notice there's console, ASP.NET, class libraries, you name it, all through here. And so if we were to open this back up, you can see we filter it by console or for desktop. That's going to be the two main ones we're going to be using in this particular course. Now the type of projects we're going to be using are Windows Forms or WPF applications. Now there's one thing here that it's really important to pay attention to, and again it gets confusing, and I've created another lecture video about this, about the difference between the .NET Framework and .NET Core and the .NET going forward. And so what you'll want to notice is that, see this Windows Forms app .NET Framework versus, if we scroll down a little bit here, you can see that there's a Windows Forms app .NET. So again, Windows Form application .NET Framework, this is the one you want to choose, the one that says .NET Framework after it. This is also true right here for the WPF applications that we'll be working with. See that it says WPF app .NET Framework versus WPF app .NET. I apologize that it's confusing. It kind of has to do with the history of how Microsoft has created this .NET Framework and these class libraries, and there's kind of this transition now on what they're doing. So the reason I've said to choose these ones that have the .NET Framework after, I think it'll just be easier for us, even though if you were creating a brand new application, you actually would create one of these other project types, and it just has to do with, again, how they've created this .NET Framework going forward, but it won't really be applicable to our class and just trying to learn C#. So again, just for our purpose, these intro applications, we're just going to work with a Windows Forms app .NET Framework. Click Next. Here, let's just call it something like demo for our project name. Location, you can see, let's just create another folder in here. We'll call it demo. This is the default location. You can save it wherever you want. It doesn't matter. We do want to place our solution into the project. That'll make more sense later. With this .NET Framework, you almost always want to begin programming with the latest and greatest framework, but it is possible to program and target previous frameworks. But for now, we're not really going to go into that. We're just going to leave it as the latest. That'll make more sense as the course goes along. Let's go ahead and click Create. And then from here, again, yours may look slightly different than mine. There may be different windows pop up, but I'm going to kind of close everything down so we can just kind of get started with how things are going to work. And the first thing I'd like to do is just kind of go through some of these menus up here on top, and then we'll kind of get into the actual programming. So if we go into the file, it's going to be typical things like creating a new project, adding new files, things of that nature, adding things to our project. We're not really going to use these what's called live share, and it's actually kind of a neat feature in that you can start this and then you can send that address to someone else and they can see exactly what's going on as you're programming here in Visual Studio. The edit window, there's only a few sort of menu items here when you're in this sort of view of just the designer. Now we'll talk about this in a second more, but I'm going to bring up just the code behind. Now if you notice, if I go to the edit menu, I actually get a lot more options within here because now we're actually looking at the code. So just be aware that sometimes these menu options can be slightly different based on which view you're actually in. So in this particular instance, this advanced tab, you can do format document. So as you're going through, if your tabs aren't lining up or your code's not lining up, you can actually do this format document and it makes your code kind of pretty and lines everything up. And again, here's the quick code for these. And then there's just lots of different things that I would recommend you go through and just try to kind of make mental notes about, oh, if I want to, I can highlight a bunch of code and comment it out just by selecting this, which is actually also right here. And again, there's just various things that are just kind of helpful to go through. Same thing outlining we'll talk about that. That has to do with these little kind of tabs that kind of collapse the code. So just go through and just kind of play with each of these little different options here. Now in the view, this is things you want to view, for instance, the code or the designer. So if I were to actually close down these little tabs, so you'll notice I can actually move the tabs back and forth if I want to, but let's close those down. And so now we want to actually look at the code for our program. You could come up here and you can get the view for all the different little windows that we're going to be interested in. So for instance, the Solution Explorer. So we'll go into more detail in a minute, but this is sort of the outline of all of our project, where all of our code files are going to be. Again, if you accidentally close this down, you can click View, Solution Explorer. Or you can come up here and let's say we want to look at the code for this. So when you click on that, you notice how that, again, that menu changes based on what's selected. So if I want to do the designer, I can do View Designer, or I can do View Code. Just various ways you can get that. Within here, we're not going to be dealing with Team Explorer, Server Explorer, just various ways that you can get to various pieces of information, but just probably more confusing than anything right now. Again, I just recommend you go through each of these and just kind of get a handle on what they do. That kind of help you a little bit more. Another one I want to talk about is the Toolbox. So if I were to open up this Toolbox, this are the tools that Microsoft has already created for us, like buttons and checkboxes and labels that we can kind of put over here on our little designer. Again, if you forget how to open that up, you just go View and then click up the Toolbox. And again, we'll go over that in just a minute. So we come down here and there's all kinds of windows. Just go through them and just kind of play with them and see which ones you find are useful. For the most part, I'm just going to be going over the main ones, so you can go over these other ones on your own. Next one that's really important is this properties window. And so what this is saying is that as we're coding here, these are going to be the properties associated with these controls. So right now I've got the form highlighted. So these are all the things that I can change about the form. We're not going to worry about the project. So this is things that we're going to can add or change about to our project over here. So if we want to add other forms, other files, other references, we can do that through this tab. So building, so this is how we can actually compile our application. So there's always going to be various ways to do it within Visual Studio. So you can click Build and then Build Solution, and that actually builds it behind the scenes. You can see Build Succeeded down here. You can also do it from here. You can click the Start button, and this will actually compile it and start the application all in one. So there's just various ways. This rebuild and clean solution. So I've seen strange things where sometimes the code just doesn't want to compile. It thinks there's a bug and there may not be. It's rare, but it does happen. So what this clean solution does is it deletes all the files from behind the scenes, and then you can sort of rebuild or build it, and it just sort of creates refreshes all that code again. Here's the debug menu. So most of the times you're going to want to debug your application. So here's some various windows so you can see where all your breakpoints are set, output from the debug, some diagnostic tools, various things with graphics that we can do. Or you can see this is kind of how we start debugging, which is the same thing as clicking the button here. Or you can just click F5. Again, something you just kind of memorize. You'll do this 8,000 times and you'll remember it. You can profile the code, which can be really helpful if you're noticing that memory continues to grow or your application just seems to be going really slow when you click this button, things like that. So you can do this profiler and actually find out maybe which methods are taking a long time. Format, again, this is just going to be, you can select multiple controls and then you can align the left, the center, make the same size, kind of just various things for these controls. Now this is going to change based on, you can see how it just kind of disappears if I'm even in here or not. Testing, we're not going to be doing any unit testing, but this is kind of an interesting feature I think you should look into on just how you can test your code within .NET. Different ways you can analyze the code. Tools, so you can install new features onto Visual Studio. You can see you got spell checkers here and various other things. This options one is something I think you should dive into here and just go through every single option and configure Visual Studio the way you like it. For instance, color theme. Some people like that dark color theme. So you can see if I click OK on dark, it's going to come in here and it kind of gives you this. Again, it's a preference. It doesn't change anything as far as programming goes, but some people just like that different experience. So go through, there's all kinds of things about debugging and how the text editor works and various things, and I think it just kind of helps you kind of get through and understand Visual Studio a little bit more. Now here's one that I think is really important. It's called this Manage Extensions. And so what it is that within the community, you can create these little extensions. So for instance, let's take a look at some of the extensions that I've already installed onto Visual Studio. So some of these extensions, you'll notice that they're actually created by Microsoft. For instance, this Live Share is an extension. Just think of it as like, artist has packed more clay, onto their art, kind of a thing. That's a way that you can create these, or Microsoft has created these. So you can see this one's created by Microsoft, some of these other ones. This one is created by EW Software. This is one I really like, and this is just a spell checker to make sure all my comments are spelled correctly, and so it acts just like Microsoft Word. And there's just all kinds of other things that just sort of help you. And so some of these, like this IntelliCode, it'll be when you're actually coding, various little hints will pop up in your code. And it'll say, hey, did you really mean to do this? Or if you coded it this way to be a little bit cleaner or more maintainable, and various things. So again, just go onto this online library and you can sort it by most recent, most downloads. We're not going to wait for it to actually retrieve it all, but just kind of go through the different tools and look at the different add-ons that, and you can just kind of read about them and see if any of those are interested to you. Over here, these are just going to be the various windows that are open and the help, which is sort of self-explanatory that you can go through there. So now let's go ahead and jump in and let's actually do some programming. Again, I know it can be confusing, so we'll just do it one more time. I'm going to close everything down here. Close all the windows down. We can just go to our view and let's go to our Solution Explorer. Again, this is sort of the main hub of our whole project. From there, you can just double click this form1.cs file, and that's going to bring up your designer. If you want to look at the code, you can right click and do view code, or you can right click here and do view code. All take you to the same place. From there, let's go ahead and open up our toolbox now. So let's come down here and do view toolbox. What we also want is our properties. So we can do view property windows. I believe you can also get it from here. And so here's kind of our basic layout for our application and our side of our Visual Studio IDE. Now, one of the things I just cannot emphasize this enough, whether you're at home or in the workplace, you're going to want multiple monitors. It's just going to make you so much more productive. And most people nowadays have multiple monitors. And what's nice about Visual Studio is you notice that I can take this Solution Explorer and it can just float anywhere I want it. So a lot of times I'll take this Solution Explorer and I'll actually put it on a monitor that's to the left of me. I'll put these properties to a monitor that's to the right, and my code and everything else will just be directly in the front. And that way I have one big screen that's just pure code that I can work with, and all of this stuff that I don't need to interact with that often, it's off to the side. It's on another monitor. Now you'll notice as I start dragging these, you can see it. These are just different places that you can dock the different things. So you can even see within this place over here, see how it docks below those. So yeah, you can just drag those out, you can pin them, do all kinds of different things. For us, I think we're going to want it, up there. This is the way I personally like to do it. So again, just play with Visual Studio and just kind of arrange these different windows the way you like it. So to begin with, let's talk about what the heck is going on in this Solution Explorer over here. So the first thing we need to understand is what a solution is. So the solution is just the container for our projects. So there's not really a lot to a solution. Think of it almost like a Windows folder. It just it's the glue that holds everything together. It doesn't actually contain any code. It just contains the various projects. So you'll notice that this particular solution contains one project that we've created, so one exe that we're trying to create. But what we can do is I could right click on here and say add new project, and it's going to bring up the same template. So let's create another Windows Forms, click next, and again it doesn't matter, we'll just create it right here, and we'll just click create. And so now you'll notice that we actually have within our solution we have two projects. So this is where everything actually takes place, is within a project. The solution again just contains multiple projects that may be related. So for instance, a real world scenario is this maybe is an application library. Maybe you're creating a DLL. And then this project actually then references that DLL. So that's one way you could have this done. Or you could have as many just exe type projects as you want in here that we have, for instance. So now at the project level, these are those different type of project types that we looked at earlier. So whether you're creating a console application, a WPF, or Windows Forms, or anything like that. So now let's just kind of go through the various files here. Properties, not really a whole lot to that. I don't think it's helpful to go over. References, if we open this up, what this is saying is that, hey, Microsoft has already written all this code for us called the .NET framework. And as lectures go on, this concept will sink in more and more. But just the very basic idea is that Microsoft, the reason you're sort of paying Microsoft for Visual Studio and these things is that they've created all of this stuff ahead of time for you. So that, for instance, you don't have to code what it means to have a button. All you have to do is take this button and drag it, drop, and now you have a button that you can change and manipulate and use how you will. This button is defined in these references. So for instance, if we were just to click on one of these and you take a look down here in the properties, see how this is actually referencing a DLL? And a DLL, it's just a package, it's a container, it's just code that's been compiled down that you can then reuse and redistribute. So they've packaged up a button and how you access databases and how you access the internet and how you do 1,000 of other things, and they've put them into these DLLs. Well, in order to use that code, you have to then reference that code. And that's what they're doing here in the references. And so what you could also do is maybe your application is very math intensive and you find there's some professor that has created code that you want to use, and he created a DLL and you pay him $300 and he gives you this DLL. And then you can just call the methods that he's already written. Well, what you can do is you can just say right click, add a reference, point it to his DLL, and now in your code you can just use it like it's built right in. You just say, dot and use his code, his methods. And that'll make more sense, as you get more familiar with .NET. So that's what the references do. In this class, we're not really going to be using much to do with the references, but in the real world, you'd definitely be using those. App.config, we're not going to worry about. So within Windows Forms, again, this is how we access. You can double click this and this will bring up our designer here. If you want to get to the code behind, you right click and do view code. This is contained on our file system in one file, form1.cs. So this is going to be our code. If we wanted more windows, we could right click and do add, and you can either do new item or we can just have this little shortcut for another Windows Forms. Just go ahead and click add there. And now you can see I've got my Form 1 and I've now got my Form 2. So you can see here I could drag other items onto that and then my Form 2 would be there. Don't need to worry about saving it. So let's go back to our Form 1. Now what tells our application, so when I click start, you'll notice that it knew to bring up Form 1 automatically. And then we could have buttons and labels on here. So what told the program to do that? Well, just like any programming language, it seems like nowadays, there's always has to be a main method that starts the application. Well, there's a file called program.cs. So if you double click this, you'll notice that in here is some code that actually starts our application. And so in this main method, it calls a few things beforehand, and then you'll notice that it is calling this application.run, and it's saying, hey, to run this application, start by opening this window. And so that's the way our application actually runs. It's very, very rare that you would ever actually do anything in this particular method. I just want to show it to you so that you know that every application, test question, I believe, that is started with the main method. And that goes for Windows Forms or WPF. So we can close that down. Now in Windows Forms, you'll notice I can actually open this up and there's something called a form1.designer.cs. So what I'm actually going to do first is I'm going to drag a button on here and I'm going to drag a checkbox on here. And we'll go over this in more in depth, but I'm just going to come over here and let's change the text of this button to hello. We'll work with the property windows more in just a second, but just remember that I changed this button, the text on it, to hello. Now if I come over here and double click form1.designer, you can see that over here this is actually what visually defines what's going on in my code. Now if I drag this over to here. So here's my designer. Here's my code behind. So let's bring that back up. And here's my designer. Now, notice right here, this class form 1, and you notice it's also called class form 1 right here. So it has the exact same name. I could have named this here, but I just left it the default as form 1. Now this partial keyword, what that means is that it actually creates two different files. They're partial files, or these partial classes, and then it actually combines them for you. The reason they did this is because this is where you're actually going to write your code, and they just wanted to create it a part that's cleaner for you to use. So everything that goes with a designer, they actually put over here in this file, but you can think of them as one file, one class called form 1. Now within this designer, if we actually open up this little area here, you can see that here's the button and a checkbox that we added to our window. So this designer is auto-generated, this file, and that's why you'd never want to actually write any code within here. So again, if I come over here and I drop a combo box in here, come back to the designer, see how it actually got modified when I did that? If we come back over here, sure enough, they're added that combo box to this initialized component code. Now, do not worry about the syntax. Again, we're going to go over lecture after lecture on the syntax. I'm just going over high-level concepts here. So what the heck actually links up these two files? Well, it's that partial keyword. So that's how the compiler knows to combine this file and this file together. Now you'll notice within this, where we actually write our code, here's the constructor. So this is the first thing that runs when we create this form, and you'll notice it put a method in here called initialize component for us. Well, there's the method right there. So another way we could actually do this is we could right-click on this, and this brings up a little sub-menu of things you can do within the code. And one thing is this go to definition. So if I click go to definition, you can see it jumps me over to this other part of the code. Again, just right-click here, and you can do go to definition. So, and there's various ways that you can navigate around Visual Studio, and so even these little pop-up menus, I just recommend that you kind of go through and just take a look at the different options you have with navigation and various features. So back in our designer, you can see when it says initialize component, it's actually creating those controls for us and setting everything that we did in the designer. For instance, you notice this line of code here is where it sets the hello to that text. So if I did change this here to like hello class and saved it, you notice it actually updated these files over here. So I come back over here and sure enough, hello class. Now again, do not do that. That's something you do not want to do, is update this designer, because more than likely you're going to end up overriding your changes and it's just going to create a headache. So the only reason they created this whole separate class here was just to keep the code clean. In older versions of Visual Studio, they didn't have this. All of this code was actually just contained right within this class here. There's nothing special about this. Again, it's just to clean up the code, and that's it. So let's go back now to our designer here, and let's actually do some coding. So I've dragged some buttons on here, and within Windows Forms, that's kind of how you develop your application. WPF is going to kind of be a different learning curve. It's sort of like HTML, and there's other lectures on that when we're talking about WPF specific. Again, just as a reminder, Windows Forms that we're using right here is never going to be used for new applications in the real world. There is no such thing as a Windows Forms team at Microsoft anymore. They're not updating, they're not maintaining it. Everything is done in WPF, or Windows Presentation Foundation. That is the future. That's the only future right now for C#. But the reason I like to use Windows Forms is, one, it's a tiny bit easier to kind of jump into, and there's a lot of legacy code out there, so it's kind of good to still actually know it. So let's kind of go through here. In our toolbox, you'll notice that we've got this top one, this all Windows Forms controls. So as you scroll through here, you can see that's obviously all of them. Or they've kind of broken it down into some of these sub ones. So common controls are going to be like buttons and labels. Containers, not really going to use a whole lot. We may use like something like a group box. So again, you're just grouping things together. So it kind of visually to the user's eye. You can these groups, maybe these have like the user's address information. So maybe it's like name, address, zip, state, and then other parts of the application have different things. We can do menus and toolbars, so we can have menu strips at the top. Data, we're not really going to be doing that until a lot later on. Various components. So components are kind of interesting. I'm not sure why they even have them here, but components are things that if you drag onto here like a timer, there's no actual visual interface. So it doesn't make sense to display a timer to the user. But you can notice that down here on a timer, we can have this timer go off. This is milliseconds. So if I change this to 1000, that says, hey, have this timer go off every second. But you would do this programmatically. It just kind of convolutes things if you do it here within the UI. So I'm just going to click delete and get rid of that. For this class, 99% of the things we're going to use are going to be in this common controls. So again, just take it, drag, drop. Now once it's in here, there's various things we can do. So for instance, if I drag and highlight these, you can kind of see how each of these are selected. Now notice that, see how these kind of have these black box and this one has a white box? So let's watch what happens there. So I drag them all, highlight them all. You can see this one has the white box. And if I come up to format and let's do align lefts, you can see how they formatted to the left of the one that's highlighted in white. Kind of just a subtle little nuance there to kind of keep in mind. So same thing as I highlight them, you can see that. You can do format, you can do align centers, rights, tops, make the same size. So I do this, just very common things that you're going to want to do using the format menu and not try to just visually try to align things. So let's take a look now at properties. So we'll come over here. And within our properties, as we click on the various controls, you can see the properties pop up for each of those controls. So what does that mean? These are just visually giving you access to the properties or the attributes, the things you can control and change about these particular buttons or labels, things like that. So let's take a look at a button. We'll just go through. Now over here, you'll notice that you can actually sort these by categories. So you can see appearance and behavior, or you can do it alphabetical. I generally prefer alphabetical. I just find it's easier to do things. Now I highly recommend this. Every time you drag a new control in here, the very first thing you want to do is change this name. So here's a button. Again, I just, as the history of the way I've learned it, I always like command for like command button. We can type hello. But I just want you to be consistent on, so if you just want to call this button hello or hello, that's up to you. Now as we go through here, I'm not going to go through every single property. That's just not productive and it would just be mind-numbing for you to listen to. But we'll just kind of go through just quickly some of the more important ones. So we're on a button here, for instance, back color. We can open it up here, we can do custom, maybe we want a nice red button, there you go. Maybe we want to make our button a little bit bigger, so we just kind of drag that there, and let's put it right there. So you can do background images, enabled, so if we were to change this to false, then the user would not be able to click this when we run our application. And it'll also kind of change the way it looks when you make it true or false. We go through down here. Oops, actually, so notice I'm on the form here. So in order to highlight that, I need to click on the button. Another way to do it is you can click here, and you can see here's a list of all the different controls, including the form that you can select. So I accidentally clicked off of that. So as we scroll down here, you can see even the size you can drag and drop, or if you wanted to manually say, oh, I need it specifically to 150 pixels wide, that's what you could do there. So text, here's how you actually change the text that we have already done there. Text align, various things. A font is probably a key one that we want to change, so maybe we want to make this a little bit more readable. We made it a little bit too big, so we'll just kind of make it a little bit there. So there we go. So each of these are going to have different sort of properties, and as the course goes on, there's going to be lectures that are going to go into specific different properties for a checkbox, for buttons, for labels, things like that. So for now, let's just do something simple. So let's put this other label on here. Remember the first thing to do, let's call this LBL message, because we're going to display a message. Now you'll notice that the auto size is set to true right here, and that's why I can't like grow or shrink. I cannot change the size of this because I've said just grow or shrink based on the text that's in here. But if I were to change this to false, you can see that I can manually do that. And let's just say message goes here, and we'll default that to that. Let's just get rid of that. Always just continually save, just like you would a Word document, Excel document. I promise you Visual Studio will crash on you or your computer will crash on you, so I just highly recommend to continually keep saving. So now what we want to do here is when we click our button, we want this message to change. So let's click on our button. Now in our IDE in Windows programming, it's what's called it's action-based. It's graphical user interface. It's not like a console application. We're actually responding to events here. So in a console application, it was just top-down, right? Your application started, and it just executed line after line after line. Well, that's not true for how a GUI application works. It responds to events. So it just sort of sits there, and it's listening. It's trying to figure out when the user has done something or a timer goes off. So for a button, there's all kinds of different events that we can get to. Again, here's the properties, and here's the events. Just click that lightning bolt. Now, while there's lots of different events that you can choose from, click is going to be the main one that you're going to use. But you'll notice that there's all kinds of things you can respond to. For instance, on hover, layout, mouse clicks, mouse hover. So rather than actually the user clicking the mouse on it, you could have them mouse leave or even just mouse hover. So when they hovered over it, you could do something. You could respond to that event. But to keep it simple, let's just work on the click event here. Now there's a couple ways we can do that. For button and other various controls, they have what's called a default method. So if I actually just double click this button right here, it actually creates that click method for me right here. So it's saying run this code when the user clicks this button. Now over here, you can see that it actually wrote this little method for us here. So this is where it put that name in there that links the two up. If I were to drag another button over here, I could call this something like my method, then press enter, and you can see it did the same thing and it created that method. Two different ways to do the same thing. So back to my hello class. I could double click this, or I could double click here, and that'll take me right back to the code, so I can now write some actual C# code. So again, this is saying, hey, when the user clicks the button, run this code. And maybe what I want to do is we'll come over here to our message, and what we want to do is change the content of this message. So sometimes you'll forget about all the different properties and ways you can manipulate these. So a good way to do it is to come into the UI here, click whatever control you're worried about, and start kind of just scrolling through these various properties. And you'll notice for a label, it's called text. If we want to change it, we want it text. Now anything you do here in the UI, these are all just written for you behind the scenes in code. And so what I mean by that is if I want to access that label, I just use its name, lbl.message, and I just put dot. And you'll notice my IntelliSense pops up here now, and you'll notice the first thing that's actually selected are all these properties and methods and events. But if I want to, I can filter them. So if maybe I just want to only see what methods are associated with this label, or maybe I only want to see what properties are associated. So for instance, you can see these are all the things that we could change. Now these will actually correspond, so like we changed the font. Well, here's the font. The size, everything, including the text for this. So in order to get to this text property, I can find it in here and double click it. Or another way that I could do that is say type in LBL message dot and then just start typing. Now C# is case sensitive, but you can see it's trying to tell me, hey, I think you really meant text, and I can just press tab and it'll fill that in. Now I can just say, my message and write the code here, and so I'm saying, hey, set the text property of this label to this particular string. So now if I go ahead and run it, you shouldn't be surprised about what's going to happen. So we'll come up here, click hello class. Oh, did I disable that? Let's go back. Aha. See how it was enabled? So because it was disabled, it actually didn't allow me to click that button. So let's go ahead and run it. Now when I click that, you'll see it actually pops up as my message. So One thing I want to go over, that it almost seems like there's kind of some magic going on here about, hey, here's this button and it calls this method. What's actually going on, and I just want to show you this again, don't worry too much about the syntax or what's actually going on, but if we go back into this designer here and we go take a look at that particular button and we scroll down here, you can see that, let's see, where's it at? For our button, it's actually going to create this line of code here. Again, don't worry about the syntax, but what this is saying is that for this click event, for this button, I want to create a new event handler. So I know an event is happening, namely the click event is happening. So what do I want to have happen? I want that button to call my method. So what this line of code does is it links up the button click event with your method called my method. So that's how they sort of get in sync between, when you click the button, here's that hello one. So with the hello button, for its click event, it's going to call this command hello click. And I can right click on here and click go to definition, and you notice it actually takes me right to that event. So that's how it sort of links up the two. Now, here's another really just common thing that I find students do, and I've done it 1,000 times. Let's say you come in here and you double click this and you didn't actually mean to create this method. And so there's a couple ways you can do this. If I just delete this and then I try to run it, you notice it's actually going to give me a compile error, and it's going to say, hey, you can't do this. So just go ahead and click no. This little error list will pop up, and if I double click this, it actually jumps me to where this error is. And so what happened is when I deleted that little piece of code, in that designer, there's still this line of code that says, hey, for this click event, go to that button 3 click method. Well, you just deleted the method. So all you have to do now is actually just delete this here, and it'll get rid of that error. Or another way you could have done that is you could have gone over here to the click event. You could actually delete it from right here, and that'll kind of do the same sort of thing. So again, if you accidentally double click a combo box, there's various ways that you can come in here, and I can just delete that, press enter, and you notice it actually deletes that code for me. And so that's just a good way to clean up your code. Now, what we can also do, now that I've got this error list also open, let's just put in a bad character here, and you can now see this IntelliSense that's sort of popping up that's helping us, that's trying to say, hey, I'm trying to figure out what you meant to do here, but I don't know what A is. You can see I can double click that and it'll take me right to my code. To show you that again, let's close this down, and I can say, oh, okay, I can double click this and it's going to take me right to where that error is. This is something, continually practice with it, because you want to get better and better at debugging, figuring out what these error messages mean. And again, this one's really bad in the sense that it's like, I just have no idea what you even typed in there. A more straightforward one that we all do a lot is something like this. We forget to leave off the semicolon, but you'll notice if I highlight this, it's saying, hey, you can see it's actually knows it's expecting that. So if I double click this, you can see it actually gives me this code, which you could click on, which will take you out here, and it'll actually tell you what the compile is, that compile error is, and it's just saying, hey, you just missed the semicolon. So you can put that there. So that's all I want to talk about for the actual programming in the IDE. But now the last thing I want to go over is where this code actually is on our file system. So over here, I'm just going to bring this over here. This is where we actually saved that demo solution. So this top level folder here, if I go into here, this contains all of our projects. So we had a demo project and a Windows Forms application. If I come back over here, you can see in our solution called demo, but we could have called this anything. There's a project called demo and a project called Windows Forms application. So back over here, when you turn in assignments, this is the level, the solution level, where I want you. Don't go in here, because I want to make sure it contains all of these files. So again, the top level solution, just right click on it, and whatever, for instance, I have WinZip, whether it's WinZip or whatever program you're using, just make sure you create a zip file at this level. So now, again, that's the solution, and here's our project called demo and some of the files that we've been using. So here's the solution. So if you were to double click the solution again is this whole container, and it'll open up this whole solution with all the projects within it. You can also double click this project, and I believe it'll actually open up the full solution also. But again, just two different files of how you can actually open up all that code for you. Now within here, here's that form1.cs. Now if I were to right click and let's just say open with Notepad, you can see that this is just a normal file. It's just a text file. There's nothing special about it, and you can open it up in any text editor that you want. And we've been working with that. Here's that designer file. Again, some of these other files, we don't really need to worry about those. Really just CS and the designer file. Now when we were building our application, it was taking this C# code, it converts it down into something called intermediate language, which then converts down into machine code when you actually run your application. We'll get into more of that later. For now, what we need to worry about is these two folders up here. If you remember in the syllabus, we talked about how if you want to email me code and you have a question and something like Gmail will block it because you can have executable code. Well, that's because of these two folders called bin and obj, or the object folder. If we're to go into the bin, and then there's a debug folder in here, you'll notice here's actually our exe for our application. So this is the compiled code. And so if you were to distribute this, you wanted to give it to someone to actually run your application, they could just double click this exe and you can see it now runs our code. So we click this and you can notice it changes to my message. So that's how you would distribute your application without giving away your source. So that's where the exe is. But again, if you want to ask me a question, you'll need to delete this bin and this object folder before you zip it up, or else Gmail will probably block it. This object thing has to do with just how it compiles down your code and combines and does a few things. So again, this is going to be on the scope of this class that if you want to, you can kind of learn more about it. But I just wanted to get you familiar with this, the format structures of the files. So just in summary, I recommend you kind of open up and play with some different projects, go through the different menus, play with kind of some of the quick keys that you can kind of memorize, like for instance Control-M-O kind of collapses everything down real quickly. There are just various things like that that you kind of learn, going through here, these different advanced, the outlining. Also go into the tools, go into the tools, set your options, the extensions, go into manage extensions, get familiar with the Solution Explorer and the properties, and various things like that. I guess one other thing, you can hold down the control key and you can scroll on your mouse wheel. You can see that zooms in and out. And again, there's in the tools options, there's all kinds of different format, with the fonts and the sizes and things like that you can change. So hopefully that all made sense.